All right, folks. Well, we can go ahead and begin. This is a presentation of the Davenant Institute, which seeks to advance and renew Christian wisdom for the contemporary church, largely through Protestant ressourcement of our classical sources, but also the contemporary application of the principles that we get in those sources in our own time. I better say all that or Colin will fire me. My dear friend Colin Redemer here is the vice president of our group, the Davenant Institute, my good friend, and I can honestly say a visionary leader for our institute. If we make it far, and I think we will, it will be in no small part due to Colin's good leadership on our behalf. I'm very grateful for him. In addition to the hat he wears at the Davenant Institute, though, Colin is also the adjunct associate professor at St. Mary's College of California, and is just about to finish a PhD, Lord willing, at the University of Aberdeen. And we're going to hear some of the fruit, I suspect, of the work he's done there in this evening's lecture entitled Old Aristotle, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Aquinas. I'm going to pass it off to Colin in just a second, but very, very briefly, for those of you who have questions as Colin is lecturing, I don't think there's a speak function. I might be able to manipulate that at the ending, but if not, there's the two ways. Obviously, the chat function that everybody's vaguely aware of in the days of Zoom, but there's also, because this is some sort of lecture function, a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen that you can also post questions in. And then at the end, I'll just go through those and read them to Colin, and we'll interact that way after I invoke my moderator's privilege and ask the first question myself. But without further ado, then I'll turn it over to Colin for this lecture we're all looking forward to. I'll turn off my screen so you don't have to stare at me and you can stare at him. He's way more handsome. He'll lecture and I'll come back, and then we'll have a discussion right after. So without further ado, I give you my good friend, future Dr. Colin Redemer.
Thanks, Joe. I want to begin tonight by talking about when I was introduced to Aristotle, and think about how that relates to when I fell in love with Aristotle, because those were not the same time. I was introduced to Aristotle, I'm pretty sure, when I was an undergraduate at Arizona State University, and it was just something I read in passing. It was an introductory ethics course for the philosophy portion of my degree, and it was just kind of presented as one among a number of options. But you could tell that virtue ethics, much like deontological ethics, were not my professor's bag. So it was sort of given short shrift. I didn't think very much of it. I didn't really fall in love with Aristotle until I began teaching him at the Great Books program at St. Mary's College of California. And I vividly remember the first Great Books course I ever taught, which was Greek thought. And I remember sitting down. No longer did I have a little selection of Aristotle clipped out and put into some sort of philosophy reader. Rather, I had the full of, and I actually have the exact book, The Nicomachean Ethics by Martin Ostwald. And it's fun looking back. I have all these marginalia from the first time I read it, and then I used different colors for other times that I read it. The first time I read it and taught it all the way through, I still wasn't sure exactly what I'd seen, but I knew that I had read something that was going to impact me profoundly if I allowed myself to sit with it. I think in part this is because the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle is genuinely a great book. There's some books, such as the Harry Potter series that I'm currently reading with my son, which I would say are very good books. Maybe you're going to disagree with me and say that Harry Potter is a great book, but at the very least, I will submit that it's a good book. I'm not, however, sure that it's the kind of book that I'm going to be tempted to kind of put my life into, base major decisions of my life on. It's not the kind of book that I'm going to feel drawn to come back to and read again and again and again. In some ways, just to make an analogy, great books are a little bit like a really nice glass of wine. Everyone, at least who I know, and if wine's not your thing, you can think about coffee, has probably had the experience of coming to a glass of wine or a cup of coffee, maybe as a child, and smelling it, and knowing that you were smelling something quite distinctive, and that distinctive just became wine or coffee to you. Or maybe you tasted it, And that just was what wine or coffee was. It was sort of bitter. It was a little strange. It wasn't like normal food. And you put it down and walked away. But a great book, like a great wine, this is a glass of California Pinot Noir, you have to come back to it a few times. And the first time you smell it, maybe you'll say, well, that's red wine. And then you start noticing something else, some fruit, some cardamom or bergamot. Save that for the end of the lecture. Great books have a similar capacity. As you read them, they open themselves up to you. There's more going on in a great book than oftentimes we're willing to recognize. And so if I didn't quite understand exactly what I had encountered the first time that I taught Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, I would say by the third or fourth time I had a pretty good handle on it. And I got to tell you, I was tremendously impressed. Old Aristotle just gripped me. When I read Aristotle and then taught him, I had this sense of what a fulsome and good and beautiful life was going to look like. Aristotle begins the Nicomachean Ethics, if you haven't read it, by talking about the point of human life. And you know, as a young adult, I think I was 25 when I began teaching it, and 26, 27, 28, I was thinking about the purpose of life as I taught it. What is the point of it? You know, and I've got this good job and I enjoy what I'm doing, and I'm enjoying teaching it. And he says, yeah, well, life has a point. It's your telos. It's the thing that all other decisions that you're making are driving you towards inevitably. That you know, you can play a game in it and say, well, if we gave everyone, you know, if you got $1 million and you went through and had to decide what you're going to spend your $1 million on, you know, what are you going to spend it on? And so, you know, maybe at first you would say, well, I'd buy a house. Well, why would you buy a house? Well, I'd buy a house because I want somewhere to live. Why do you want somewhere to live? Well, and why and why and why? And if we keep asking that set of questions, eventually, Aristotle says, you're going to land at, well, because I want to be happy. It's actually the end, which is the determining feature of humans, is that we want happiness. That's what makes us who we are. And then he says, well, but then we have to think about what happiness is. Can we know more about it? And in the second book of the Nicomachean Ethics, he says, well, yeah, happiness is not just something that randomly happens to us. It's not just a feature of your genetics, because that would be just kind of cruel and unjust. It's not arbitrary. It's not just a random gift of the gods, even though some of these things might help us as we're thinking through happiness. Happiness ultimately is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. And if there's multiple virtues, the highest and the best virtue. And of course, the soul here isn't Patrick Swayze, you know, in Ghost, sort of this like ethereal vision of a something. The soul for Aristotle, you realize in De Anima, is the soul is the form of the body. In some way, it's not, it's the shape, but also the inner structure. It's what we are. And so happiness is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, and the soul is something that has to do with your body, and so therefore virtue is an activity. It's something you're up to in your life. And then he starts laying out what these various virtues are. So virtues, particularly the moral virtues, the ones that we do, are habits of choosing the mean between two vices. So courage is in between recklessness and cowardiceness. It's a little bit closer to recklessness. And so you can kind of think through a moral exemplar, somebody who's a little bit more courageous than you are, and you can make your actions just slightly better and get closer and closer and closer to who this person might be. And you can kind of attenuate yourself to it, and it's textured and it's detailed. It's not a one-size-fits-all morality the way that I had felt when I read Kant as an undergraduate, where it was just this strict, you know, do this, don't do that. Everyone has the same measure that's measuring them. It was detailed. It paid attention to who I was. Aristotle works through a variety of virtues, and then he says, well, okay, so imagine you've got these virtues, there's still something lacking. And what is that something? That something is somehow friendship. You need someone to practice these virtues with. Even if you're already virtuous, you need somebody with whom you can exchange gifts with and have conversations with. And of course, if you have to think of the ordering of what is important in a human life, well, the most important stuff isn't the lowest stuff down. It's not filling my belly. It's not even winning in a competition. You know, the most important stuff somehow is happening up here. It's happening on the contemplative level. And so what you're doing as you're contemplating, though, is somehow having an inner conversation with yourself. And so isn't it going to be just a little bit more exciting if you could find someone else who's also got a well-ordered soul, somebody who's practiced in the virtues you can have that conversation with. And so, of course, if you look at two happy men and one of them is happy and is good and has good friendships, and one of them is happy and is good and doesn't, you know, clearly the man with friendships has more. And so friendship is this necessary component and the capstone of the virtuous life that Aristotle lays out for us. And then in the end, right, what are you doing with that friend? What you're doing with that friend is contemplating. You're contemplating the highest and the best things. You're engaging in this conversation with the friend. And I remember reading Aristotle and teaching him. And I would call this the standard reading of Aristotle. If you talk to most people who are pretty familiar with Aristotle, this is what they're going to say that Aristotle's theory is. And I remember teaching it and thinking, well, that's it. That's as good as it gets. But then after a few more years of teaching him, after a little while of resting with the text and of studying it and of writing about it, I think I've come to see that there's some deeper problems with Aristotle than the standard reading can account for. And so if the standard reading of Aristotle is this very kind of happy ending version of Aristotle, the reading that I want to offer you now is what I'm going to call the tragic reading of Aristotle. And the tragic reading of Aristotle agrees actually on many points with what I laid out earlier, the standard reading. He does say that happiness is the end of man. He does say happiness is the activity of the soul in accordance with the virtue. He does say virtue is the mean between two vices. He does lay out all of these virtues that he thinks you can get. And then he also tells you that you're going to need friendship if you're going to do this, and that you're ultimately wanting to contemplate God. But I think that standard reading glosses over in particular 3 points that he stumbles at, and in those 3 points, I think there's an all-encompassing and definitive problem at the heart of Aristotle's ethical theory. And so the tragic reading involves 3 things, 2 of which I think are relatively uncontentious, and 1 of which is a little bit contentious. And if we end up having some contention during the Q&A, fine. I think we can handle that. The first problem, which produces the tragic reading, I would say is the problem of the man of practical wisdom. So when Aristotle is working through his ethical theory about the virtues, and this is the most contentious one, so I'm going to go from the most contentious to what I think is the least contentious. And it's contentious because people, when Aristotle deploys the concept of the man of practical wisdom, it's right there in book, I think it's book 2, where he's defining virtue. And in book 2, where he's defining virtue, he says that virtue is a habit of choosing the mean between 2 vices, such as a man of practical wisdom would do. And at first, and then he just continues on. And at first, you read this and you think, well, yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable. But then, of course, you ask, well, wait. Who's the man of practical wisdom, Aristotle? Who is this person? Now, Aristotle is always, at least, I think, aware of the questions that I'm going to be raising for him, even when I think he has insufficient answers. And so he does actually, in book 6, chapter 5 of the Nicomachean Ethics, answer this question. He talks about how, we have to think through who the phronimos is. This is the term. Phronesis is the term for practical wisdom. And so who is this phronimos? And he actually begins chapter 5 of book 6 by saying, well, we have to study the person whom we attribute practical wisdom to. And then he goes on to talk about practical wisdom. But notice that he doesn't tell you who the man of practical wisdom is that he's going to be studying. The man of practical wisdom is a problem because if you don't know who the man of practical wisdom is, or if you don't have the example of the man of practical wisdom, you can never know exactly how you're supposed to be choosing the mean between the various vices. You never know exactly what you're supposed to be doing in any given situation. It's in some ways a bit of a cornerstone that holds the working of the ethical theory together. In the end, I believe that Aristotle is sort of presenting himself as the man of practical wisdom. But once again, it's not clear that he thinks he's ready to be able to take that on, which is why he doesn't name himself. So if that one's a bit contentious, we can put it to one side and deal with the two other problems in the text that I think are pretty inarguable. The first one I want to deal with is the problem of God. And so we've dealt with the man of practical wisdom. We have to think through the problem of God. Okay, well, why is God a problem? Well, the first thing you need to think about is who is God to Aristotle. So Aristotle does not believe in the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. He's not believing in Jesus as God. He also, interestingly, basically just doesn't believe in the God of the pagans. So he's not sitting here thinking of Zeus when he talks about God. He says in the metaphysics that God is the unmoved mover. So if you've ever heard the term the unmoved mover, this owes a debt to Aristotle for sure. That God somehow is this thing out of love of which all other things move, but which itself does not move, nor, we should note, does it love. So why is God a problem? Well, God is a problem for a couple of reasons. So the first of which, in the Eudaimian Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 7, he talks about how happiness is the thing that we're aiming for. So this is Book 1 of his other ethics, which is lesser read, the Eudaimian Ethics, which we're studying this term at Davenant Hall. You can sign up for courses at davenanthall.com, just to make a plug for future listeners. The Eudaimian Ethics is his first ethical treatise, which was his first attempt to write an ethical treatise. And in Book 1 of the Eudaimian Ethics, much like Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle is trying to make his argument for happiness as the point of human life, that we're all aiming for happiness. Well, in the Eudaimian Ethics, one of the things that he stumbles over as he's writing this is he says, well, happiness is what we're aiming for, but of course, we don't want the happiness of a cucumber, because cucumbers can't, even enjoy tasting things. We don't want the happiness of a basset hound, because basset hounds, while they can taste things, can't contemplate. So what we want is the happiness of a human, which involves continuing to exist the way cucumbers do. It involves also enjoying pleasures like a dog does, but it enjoys this other, perhaps highest form of enjoyment, which is contemplation. However, in Book 1, Section 7 of Eudaimian Ethics, he mentions that happiness of a higher form of being is possible, and that being would be the happiness of a god, but of course it's inaccessible to us. This is echoed, while not in Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, it is echoed in Book 8, 9, and 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics in slightly different ways. So in Book 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Chapter 7, he says, should we want our friends to be a god, right? Friendship is so important, and we're supposed to have these great friendships, with the best possible friendships with the best possible people, where we talk about nothing but the best things. Should I want that best friend of mine to be a god? Well, this is tricky, right? Because on the one hand, being a god would be superior to being a human. On the other hand, it's not clear that I would want my friend to be a god, because then I wouldn't be able to be friends with them anymore. And so I guess you wouldn't want your friend to be a god. Similarly, in Book 9, Chapter 4, the question comes up, should you yourself want to be a god? Because being a god would clearly be happier than being a human. There's more pleasure, there's more contemplation, they have better lives, they don't die. Wouldn't this be better? And Aristotle sort of stumbles around the question in this section. He says, well, in the end, you don't really want to be a god, because that would mean that you wouldn't want to be yourself. And so somehow there's no way for him to square what it would mean for me to be me and for me to be a god. Somehow, if I were to be able to become a god, while I might have a happiness that I don't currently have, I couldn't be I anymore. So he's sort of stumbling around the problem. And then finally, in book 10, chapter 8, he says, and here in book 10, he's sort of had his conversation about friendship, and he's talking about the life of contemplation. And he says, well, yeah, in the life of contemplation, we have to live according to the divine within us. That which is most divine is our contemplative faculty, and the gods are happy. And so we should live according to that. But of course, then he reminds readers, but we can't really be gods. Just keep that in mind. So we can see this longing and this problem that divinity represents. This is echoed in the Metaphysics. You can look at book 1, chapter 12, or book 12, chapter 7, and see similar problems popping up. So by no means am I trying to say that this list I'm giving you tonight is the exhaustive list of places these problems show up. I just want you to see some options. The third, and I think greatest problem for Aristotle, is the problem of death. Aristotle has laid out a beautiful vision of what happiness looks like. But I think in the face of our inevitable bodily death, his happiness is insufficient. Further, I think that Aristotle is aware of this. He has an extensive discussion about death in Nicomachean Ethics, book 1, chapter 10 through 11. He actually talks not only about his own death, he also talks about the potential death of his friends. In the end, he recognizes that the happiness he's talking about is the happiness of human beings. And that's actually how he ends chapter 11. The happiness we're talking about is just the happiness of human beings. Again, implicitly gesturing towards the possibility of a further happiness of immortal beings. And then his next line, so much for this question. Let's move on. I don't want to talk about this anymore. What's happening here is a problem because Aristotle says a few things. One, remember that happiness is an activity. It's something that we do. 2, it has to do with our contemplative life. 3, death seems to be the end of activity. Well, then how can we call a dead person happy? 4, it's actually more complicated than that because it seems as if we shouldn't call someone happy while they're still alive. After all, I might be living a perfectly happy Aristotelian life right now. But then there might be some horrible scandal where it turns out I've been embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Davenant Institute, which is how I'm living this luxurious lifestyle out here in the sunny state of California. And then, if this gets exposed and then, my wife leaves me and the kids all hate me and my name is dragged through the mud. And then I die in a horrible car accident where my body is mangled and just imagine what you'd like. Well, in a case like that, you would have to say, yeah, that person sort of they were getting close to happiness. They were sort of doing something that approximates happiness, but in the end, we would have to judge that life as not happy, right? And certainly we would say that the happiness sort of ceased at the point at which all these horrible activities get exposed and are going on. And so 2 problems, and they really run up against each other. 1, seems like we can only call someone happy once we've looked at their full life. 2, happiness implies a certain completion. And 3, happiness implies a certain activity. If we put those things together, we realize, well, it's not clear that we can call people happy while they're alive. It's also not clear that we can call people happy while they're dead. And so the problem of death, I think, is the most problematic piece of his entire work. And of course, this is not unrelated to the problem of gods. Since the gods are immortal, it seems easier to figure out what happiness might look like for them. So I would say that having now read Aristotle for many more years, and having taught him for many more years, when I read Aristotle, I do read the standard version. I read this person who's thinking about the best way life could possibly be. I read this person who's very unlike the Stoics, who just make their peace with death. They make their peace with the fact that we're not gods. They tell us to stop wanting those things. Aristotle doesn't do that. He knows we want those things. He's not willing to make peace with death. He's not willing to say that there's no way for us to be happy. He knows that he wants it, and he knows he's not going to be satisfied with anything less. And yet I think he ends his philosophizing by knowing that he didn't get it, and that maybe he doesn't know how to get it. But he knows he's not going to stop until he gets it. So it's at this point that I'm going to pivot and start talking a little bit about Thomas Aquinas. But before I do, I want to mention why. And so I mention why because I think when you read most Aristotelian literature that's been written about from the Christian perspective, particularly in the contemporary era, the overwhelming majority of people come to Aristotle through Aquinas. And so it's relatively uncontroversial to note that Roman Catholics read a lot more Thomas Aquinas than Protestants do at this point in history. And when you read Thomas Aquinas is constantly referring to the philosopher. This is his pet name, I would say, for Aristotle. And so in his constant reference to Aristotle, the communities who read Thomas Aquinas and love Thomas Aquinas all know that on some level they have to take Thomas Aquinas and go back to Aristotle to think through what Thomas is saying relative to Aristotle. So most people actually come to be reading things like the Nicomachean Ethics because they first have had some level of dealing with Thomas Aquinas. My situation is a little bit different. I actually really had never read Thomas Aquinas. I probably had him assigned at some point in my undergraduate years. I had read some for sure. I actually know I have because I have a book that is at least on my shelf, even if I didn't read it properly as an undergraduate, many such cases. But I really had not taken him very seriously. And even in the Great Books program, where I would teach Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, basically cover to cover, year after year, sometimes multiple times a year, they would give you a relatively tiny little bite-sized piece of the Summa Theologiae to read and teach. And so I had fallen in love with Aristotle, and it really wasn't until I knew Aristotle quite well that I showed up to Aquinas. And so when I read Thomas Aquinas, one thing that just immediately stuck out to me was that here is somebody who loves Aristotle and loves Aristotle's way of thinking and is going to follow Aristotle to the bitter end and say, we can't just let our desires die on the vine. We have to cling to them like it's all we've got. And so in that sense, I think Thomas Aquinas, I would call him the theologian of desire. He really, really does want us to try to think through what it is that we want as humans, because what we want as humans is in large part how we were made. And I don't mean what you want, like I'd like a grilled cheese sandwich right now. I mean what we want in general as a community because of what we are as humans, the shared common life we have together. And so when Thomas Aquinas is writing the Summa Theologiae, in the second part of the second part, it's the first part of the second part, in question 4, he deals with the question about the things that are required for happiness. And so here we can see somebody who's directly dealing with the things that Aristotle had in mind. So what is required for happiness, right? We've read and we've thought about together, even just in this lecture a little bit, what is it that Aristotle thinks is required for happiness? And so he asks things like, is delight required for happiness? And so is delight required for happiness? Well, yeah, it is required for happiness as something attendant upon it. We might say that heat is necessary for fire, and in this way, delight is necessary for happiness. So we can't have happiness without delight. For it's caused by appetite being at rest in the good attained. So it's a bit like, when you've had a really nice meal and your appetite is satiated, there's there's a relation between appetite and happiness that's intrinsic and natural, and it's not going to go away. But there is, from his perspective, a satisfaction of that desire. Wherefore, since happiness is nothing else but the attainment of the sovereign good, it cannot be without concomitant delight. And so there is this good that we can go get in Aquinas. And when we get it, there is the fulfillment of this deep desire and longing, and there's a joy that comes with it. And then he also talks about how vision is involved. And here I want to pause for a second after I help us think through this. So he says that vision ranks before delight. So why would vision rank before delight? In the analogy, particularly of eating, it's not abundantly clear that you have to kind of see the meal before you can enjoy the meal. But he says the vision ranks before delight. He says in his answer for whether vision ranks before delight, that delight perfects operation as vigor perfects youth. Because it is as a result of youth. So vigor is a result of youth. Consequently, delight is a perfection attendant upon vision, but not a perfection whereby vision is made perfect in its own species. Okay, well, what does he mean here? What he means is that delight is a perfection that's attendant upon vision, but again, it's when he's saying perfection, he's saying that the vision is itself coming alongside the thing perfected. We have to think through what he means by vision here. So in other words, if go back to the food analogy, we can't think of it in terms of I have to see the food before I eat the food. But we do have to think through whether or not certain senses are going to be related to our happiness or not. And so I don't think that he means vision with the biological material of the eye. And that's a part of why this is a tricky question that he's trying to puzzle through. So we have to think of the ordering of the senses that Aristotle's offering us. And again, I think this is a place where you see Aristotle being really closely right underneath the surface for Aquinas, even in places where he's not making it explicit. Aristotle talks about the ordering of the senses, and he says that, while the senses share something in common, each sense does do something a little bit different. And we actually hierarchically understand our own bodily senses. And you might say that's kind of strange. How can you rank, smell versus taste? Well, you have to think of something like this, Imagine you came home to your spouse and you said, hey, honey, I thought of someone else and they seemed nice. Hey, honey, I looked at someone else and they looked nice. Hey, honey, I heard someone else and they sounded nice. Hey, honey, I smelled someone else and they smelled nice. Hey, honey, I tasted someone else and they tasted nice. I touched someone else and they felt nice. I don't know exactly where your spouse would slap you on that list of things if you came home and said that. But I'm willing to bet that for most of you, by the time we got to the end of that list, you're having a different response to the idea than you were having at the beginning, right? I touched someone and they felt nice. It just has a different vibe to it than I saw someone else and they looked nice. And so vision somehow has to do with knowledge. There's a hierarchy to the senses even in our own bodies from Aristotle's perspective, and vision is the closest one to contemplation. It's the highest sense of our physical senses, and it's the most closely related to the perhaps non-physical sense of contemplation and thought. And so vision ranks before delight in that we have to know somehow. And the knowledge of what it is that we want is itself somehow also the satisfaction of what we want. Now, again, I think Aristotle sort of intimated pieces of this, right? When he talks about how inside of God, you have thought thinking itself. There's a recognition that as you are in that friendship with your friend, what should you be talking about? You should be talking about the highest things. What's the highest thing? The highest thing is God. And so we should be having conversations and thinking about God, and God is thought thinking itself. However, if vision ranks before delight, we can understand perhaps why Aristotle wasn't satisfied, because he didn't quite have enough vision to see what God was, which would have had the ability, the possibility opened to him to be able to satisfy the desire that he had. Aquinas continues, and he talks about whether or not comprehension is necessary for happiness. Do we have to really know it to be able to be happy with it? And we can see, of course, how comprehension is related then to vision. For perfect knowledge of the end, he says, corresponds to imperfect knowledge. Presence of the end corresponds to the relation of hope, but delight in the end now present results from love, as already stated, and therefore these three must concur with happiness, to wit, vision, which is perfect knowledge of the intelligible end, comprehension, which implies the presence of the end, and delight or enjoyment, which implies repose of the lover in the object beloved. Okay. And so is comprehension necessary? Notice that when he says comprehension here, what he means is an awareness of the thing as present. And so it's not enough just to know that God is out there. You have to also have an awareness that God is with you. And again, for Aristotle, the God is the unmoved mover. He's so beyond our comprehension. We can just kind of barely get glimpses of him, and we know a bit about him by nature. But one thing we could never know by nature is that God is with us. And so again, you can see the ways in which Aquinas is fulfilling the problems that are inherent in Aristotle's system, and which are inherent in the problem of what it is to be a human. Whether rectitude of the will is necessary for happiness. He says, this is Aquinas again, the end in comparison to what is ordained to the end is as form compared to matter. So the end in comparison to what is ordained to the end, so that's us, right? The end is God and we are ordained to the end, is compared to as form compared to matter. Somehow there's a conforming nature that we're going to be informed by this form. Wherefore, just as matter cannot receive a form unless it be duly disposed thereto, so nothing gains an end except it be duly ordered thereunto. Somehow, there's a formational process that is happening to us in our temporal existence, which brings us into a likeness of Christ. The rectitude of the will is necessary for happiness. Is the body needed for man's happiness? This is a really fascinating one to think about relative to Aristotle. Aquinas says that happiness is twofold. One is imperfect and is had in this life, and the other is perfect and consists in the vision of God. Okay. Is the body needed for man's happiness? Well, on one level, yes, it is. Because we can't really be happy here in this life and be dead and disembodied. You have to be in a body to be happy in one sense. However, the happiness that we can have in this body is somehow imperfect. And we know this even in our own bodies, right? That's what Aristotle knew. This is what he was banging his head against. When Vermigli actually is commenting on Book 1, Chapter 10 and 11 of the Nicomachean Ethics, he actually says something really similar to Aquinas here. He says that Aristotle's vision of happiness can only be called political happiness, that it's the happiness that you can have inside of the human community of our bodies right now. But that there's a further happiness, which again, Vermigli agrees with Aquinas here and says that Aristotle didn't know about. Well, what is it that Aristotle didn't know? He didn't know the revelation of God. He didn't know Jesus Christ. He didn't know the good news of the gospel. And so is the body needed for man's happiness? Well, yeah. But also, no. It is possible for us to be in the presence of God by God's grace and contemplating the beatific vision of God, which is the fulfillment of the happiness that we have now in potency in the form of our desire, right? That desire that we have that Aristotle is such a good excavator of is in some ways an outline of the happiness that we're going to get in eternity, and which we already know that we have in part by desire. Is perfection of the body needed for happiness? And I think I only have about 5 more minutes, so if I don't get through all of these, do go through and think through. But is perfection of the body needed for happiness? Well, Aquinas says happiness does not consist in bodily good as its object, but bodily good can add a certain charm and perfection to happiness. I love that line. And so you can think about somebody who's, a perfectly fine house guest, and then you can think about somebody who's a perfectly fine house guest with a certain charm, which, of course, it adds something to it, right? There's something really quite pleasant about that. And so perfection of the body, happiness doesn't consist in bodily good, but bodily good is included when we're talking about happiness, because it adds a certain charm and perfection to what we're talking about when we talk about happiness. Are external goods needed for happiness? Well, Aquinas says, consequently, these external goods are nowise necessary for that happiness, since they are ordained to the animal life. And since in this life, the felicity of contemplation as being more godlike approaches nearer than that of action to the likeness of that perfect happiness, therefore it stands in less need of these goods of the body, as stated in the Ethics 10. Okay. I actually don't quite have time. Maybe we'll come back to that one in the Q&A, because I want to get to the last one, which is very near and dear to my heart. In the last one, Aquinas deals with the question whether fellowship of friendship is necessary for happiness. And again, remember that Aristotle deals so in such great depth with the question of friendship. And here in the Summa, when Aquinas is asking whether friendship is necessary for happiness, here's what he says. If we speak of the happiness of this life, the happy man finds friends, as the philosopher says, that he may do good to them, and that he may delight in seeing them do good. Again, that he may be helped by them in his good work. For in order that man may do well, active or contemplative, he needs the fellowship of friends. So, we need people. You can't, as Aristotle said, any man who lives outside the walls of the city completely alone is either a beast or a god. Humans are political. You have a belly button. It means you need friends. But if we speak of perfect happiness, which will be our heavenly fatherland, the fellowship of friends is not essential to happiness, since man has the entire fullness of his perfection in God. But the fellowship of friends conduces to the well-being of happiness. Hence, Augustine says, the spiritual creature receives no other interior aid to happiness than the eternity, truth, and charity of the Creator. But if they can be said to be helped from without, perhaps it is only by this that they see one another and rejoice in God at their fellowship. Okay. It sounds to you, the first time you read it, as if Aquinas is saying that friendship is not necessary for happiness. After all, the fellowship of friends is not essential to happiness. That's actually exactly what he says. What he's referring to by friendship here is other people. The real way he could have rephrased this is, do you need friendship with other people to be happy? And actually in this, I think we can detect that Aquinas is closer to Aristotle than it might appear at first, because Aristotle himself says that the really happy man isn't going to be having thousands of friends. He's going to have a small group. And in fact, probably it'll be just 2 friends together, ignoring, for the most part, the political life of the city around them. And those 2 friends are going to be focused on virtue and talking about virtue, and of virtue's the highest and the best virtue. And ultimately, they'll be in a contemplative experience where they contemplate and talk about God together. Okay, those 2 friends, right? And so that means that Aristotle's saying we're going to ignore most people most of the time, just like Aquinas is saying you don't need most people. But what Aquinas isn't saying is that you don't need friendship at all, depending on what we mean by friendship. Because what he is going to recognize is that you do need one friend above all others. And that friend is God. And so therefore, the kind of community of friends is not necessary. However, the friendship with that one person that Aristotle talked about is absolutely necessary, and that friendship is the friendship with God. And so, as we're closing out the lecture, what I want to say, I'll say one thing first, which is from my friend Ann Carpenter. Ann Carpenter once told me that Thomas Aquinas always wept when he was at Mass, right, during the Eucharistic service, because for him, sorrow over sin and gratitude for mercy, yearning for beatitude, are all gathered up together in his tears. Happiness and tears, then, are not opposed, at least in this life. And so the tears that we can see and weep as we read Aristotle and come to see the tragic nature of his project, of the intensity and magnitude of his desire, and his patent inability to find a way to achieve that most fundamental and human desire. Those tears and that happiness, which he actually is talking about, and which Aquinas helps us to see is finally fulfilled in the gospel and in our relationship with Christ. Those happinesses and those tears are not opposed to one another in this life. I need a happiness for my body, but I need there to be a happiness beyond the happiness of my body. Otherwise, the happiness of my body is just a beautiful tragedy. And so Aquinas says to Aristotle that the happiness which Aristotle considered impossible, it is possible with God and in God. We have to sort of end by thinking through this question of desire. Aquinas looks at Aristotle, and Aristotle says, where is the man of practical wisdom? And Aquinas says, it's Christ. Aristotle says, isn't it so problematic that we can think of this God and yet we can't become like him without losing our identity? And Aquinas points to us and says, yes, lose your identity in Christ and become like him. Fulfill the longing of your heart in that way. Aristotle says, isn't it tragic that I and everyone I know and love are going to die? And Aquinas, weeping with Aristotle, says, yes, but you can have life. Aristotle knew that nature does not produce any desire which cannot be fulfilled. Aristotle had a desire for eternal happiness that does not end and does not run dry. He knew that that was an aspect of what it means to be a human. It's a natural desire. And that means that there is a way to fulfill it, even if Aristotle did not get it. I submit that that way was the way of Jesus. Thank you.
All right, excellent. That was great. And I'm sure there's a lot of questions forthcoming. Again, I'm going to ask Colin a question here in a bit, but there's the comment section. There's also the Q&A section. It looks like we already have a couple of good-looking questions. Great. Yeah, maybe just a comment, Colin. You point to these three areas, and as you were talking through them, it was striking me what you said at the very end, actually, this whole lecture, that you have the problem of kind of like, who is the moral exemplar? This is one problem. You have the problem of death and its relationship to happiness. And all I could think of is is works I've been reading in the last couple of years on how the early Christian movement really did become this worldwide movement, partially because, for instance, the account of the resurrection really does give humans some hope that there is life after death, not in just an abstract philosophical sense, but in the concrete sinews of history. In a sense, you actually see an overcoming of the fear of death in such a way that even Caesar, can't prevent the spread of Christianity. And similarly, just the example of Christ and the actual rhetorical and historical power, especially if we argue that the Holy Spirit is part of that. But I think that it's just very interesting to think of Aristotle as almost a philosophical surrogate in a sense, open-ended, but not having these answers. And then on the other side of the resurrection, you see Aquinas reflecting on this, and I think that's fascinating. But it looks like we have a pile of questions here. This is great. Brad Kafer asked, does Aquinas root friendship with God in the incarnate Christ? Friendship with God sounds good, but also unattainable, whereas Christ as our mediator means we have friendship with God in human form. Would you say that the incarnation then provides us with the ultimate means of this friendship for perfect felicity?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think when I think of the incarnation, we tend to think about God sort of becoming a baby and becoming a human, and this is true. But Athanasius makes clear for us that, and he's not the only one, that to speak more specifically, I think that's a fine way of thinking about it, right? And so, when I'm teaching my daughter about the incarnation, it's like, look at baby Jesus, and God became a baby. And that is true. I mean, that just is true. You can say that. There's nothing wrong with saying it. But when you want to get more technical, right, because God's not like spatially geolocating himself inside of this baby. So what's happening is God is taking humanity into himself. And so, in a way, what it means for you to be a human on the other side of the incarnation, if you've accepted Christ, is that you're one with Christ. You're in Christ, and in Christ means in the life of the Trinity. All of creation is different on the other side of the incarnation. It's not just that like God is different. And so friendship with Christ, which is, of course, Jesus himself talks about friendship with Christ. You're somehow able to have this friendship with Christ, which, it's made possible by the incarnation. But I think the event of the incarnation meant that it was always in principle available to humanity, even if you lived before it, because the means by which you would achieve it is in fact faith. And that's why you can have Abraham as a friend of Jesus, right? Because by faith, he trusted God, that God was going to figure it out, a way through, even though, Abraham was not Aristotle. So he did not know,
Yeah. Maybe riffing on the question a bit, would you say that the incarnation adds something or has some maybe climactic element of God's friendship with man, that the divine friendship we have with the divine nature, really through the world of creation in a sense, takes on, in a way, the friendship of God with man takes on the most precise face and texture, as it were, in the incarnation? Could you say something like that? That there's
absolutely. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is you can't have friendship with God without the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The whole thing is absolutely necessary.
I see. Okay. But right, it would have been available before. Sure. Okay.
Right.
Aaron Tychicus asks, where's a good place to start reading on this topic? Aquinas commentary on Aristotle, or if so, which one? And if not, what's the right source?
Yeah, I'll because I'm trying to build an organization here, guys. So buy Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics Commentary by Peter Martyr Vermigli, and do yourself some good. It's a fine place to start. Asking the question, where's a good place to start, always depends on who's talking to me. So if you're somebody who's never read the Nicomachean Ethics, start by reading the Nicomachean Ethics. I think it's a very fun and user-friendly book, though I have very good friends who I consider very intelligent, who say that it is not, in fact, a fun or user-friendly book. So maybe the place to start then is to take a course on Aristotle at Davenant Hall. If you're already familiar with Aristotle on some level, you can read Aquinas' commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics. I actually find it to be some of Aquinas' duller writing. And so perhaps just grabbing that section of the Summa that I talked about today and trying to think through it with some friends who, are just do it like a Bible study, right? Grab the Summa. You can get it for free online at Isidore. Just type Isidore Aquinas Summa, and then look at the first part of the second part, question 4, and just try working it through.
All right. Matthias asks, can God be a friend as friends are understood in the Greco-Roman world?
I don't see this question anywhere.
Oh, it's in the Q&A. It's
in the
Q&A.
Q&A. Okay, I see.
Oh,
I see it now.
yeah.
It was already answered. Even though I had not answered it. Can God be a
Yeah,
friend?
I was jumping the gun.
Greco-Roman world. I think so. In fact, it depends on what you mean by as friends are understood in the Greco-Roman world. I think it would be an overstatement to say that Aristotle's understanding of friendship is like the normative understanding of friendship for everyone. It's not as if everyone in the Greco-Roman world is going around talking about things with the level of philosophical precision that you see Aristotle dealing in. But if what you're really asking is, can we understand our friendship with God in the terms that Aristotle offers us? I think absolutely. One of the problems you might have with me answering in that way is that that Aristotle is often misread. So that standard reading that I gave you the first time is, I think, how most of the literature you're going to run into reads him, and it's going to be rare that you find people who recognize the real problems, the tricky problems inside of his understanding. And so, for example, John Cooper, who's a fantastic scholar in so many ways, I think just misreads Aristotle, for example, because he reads him as just in this kind of general way, which isn't wrong, but I think it doesn't pay attention enough to certain significant details. And I'll offer one more that I didn't cover in the lecture. And so one of those significant detail is when Aristotle talks about what a friendship is, he's clearly building towards a peak, right? Because he always thinks that the highest and best expression of the thing is the meaning of the thing, right? So if you're trying to figure out what dogs are, you don't go find a bunch of mutts. You find purebreds, you find racing hounds or something, and you dissect them and you study them, and that's what's going to tell you about dogness. And so there is a way in which he's saying we should look at lots of examples, but he wants to find lots of excellent examples. Okay, when he gets to the very peak of his definition of friendship, he says friendship is a synesthetic relationship between two people, meaning it's about shared perception. And if it's about actually shared perception, like Joe and I have a good friendship and we talk and whatever, but like if you stab Joe, I don't bleed. Don't stab Joe, everyone. But if you give
or
him,
dissect dogs,
right? Or if you, thank you. Unless, there might be a reason you need to.
That's true.
But if you give Joe a candy bar and he's enjoying a Snickers, I will not taste the sweetness of it. And synesthesia would require that. He only says it once in the entire Nicomachean Ethics, but again, I think it's one of these kind of weird problems. However, I think in Christ, this is the level of relatedness that we're able to achieve, is this synesthetic relationship with one another. And it's talked about in Scripture, right? That like we're going to bear one another's burdens. Your pain is going to become my pain in a way that I think is a little mystical to us when we read about it in Scripture, and we don't. It's uncomfortable. We don't like reading about it. So anyhow, that's just kind of one more bit to the puzzle. I can talk about each one of these questions for the whole night, but I have to kind of stop myself.
Bart C in the other chat box asks, how can the knowledge of a person be related to the idea of an ideal friendship? Let me make sure I got that right. Yes. How can the knowledge of a person be related to the idea of an ideal friendship? Did Aquinas raise this issue on the notion of friendship?
It's a good question. I don't want to claim to be an expert on Aquinas on the issue of friendship in the way that I am and willing to sort of say I am sort of an expert on Aristotle's ideas about friendship. So I don't know if Aquinas raises that specific issue. How can the knowledge of a person be related to the idea of an ideal friendship with a person? So knowledge is related to the problem of an ideal friendship, at least in Aristotle, in at least this way, which is, virtue is a form of knowledge in some sense. And furthermore, I have to actually know that you are a virtuous person for us to be a good friend. I have to actually, in some way, you have to be my object of contemplation if we're going to be really good friends. because I'm sitting around talking with you and about virtue, and we're talking about the highest and best things. We're contemplating these things together. And so, one of the misnomers that you often hear, which is actually a good teaching tool at the beginning, is that friendship is distinguished from lovers. And so this might be a good lead into the next question, because lovers will look at one another and friends are sitting side by side looking at something outside themselves, right? But in Aristotle's account, actually, the friends are looking at one another. But what they're looking at is not the body of the friend. What they're looking at is actually the image of virtue that friend is manifesting into reality. And so the friend in some ways becomes a bit like an image of, like an icon of virtue or something. In the best forms of friendship, right? We're not talking about friendships of pleasure and usefulness right now. We're talking about, friends of virtue, as some people might call it, or something like that. And so you are looking at one another and talking to one another. And what you're talking about is sort of one another. But of course, what one another is at this point is a bit disembodied and idealized, because you're really dealing with virtue. And if there's a problem with your friend or a problem with you, you should talk about that and figure out how to fix it so that you can just manifest the virtue more clearly.
Yeah, and that then, as you noted already, this sort of segues into this next question by Kate Kramer. In Book 8 of Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle writes that virtuous friendship is impossible between non-equals, including between man and wife. Aquinas in the Summa Contra Gentiles, questions 123 and 124, shows how marriage fulfills each of the requirements of virtuous friendship laid out by Aristotle, even quoting Book 8 of Nicomachean Ethics. Aquinas ends by claiming that marriage is potentially the greatest of friendships, intentionally contradicting the philosopher. Is this due to a shift in Aquinas in his understanding of friendship, marriage, or women? Yeah, what account cites for that?
Really, really great question. And so when I'm trying to answer this question, I think we need to make a few points clear. So the first of which is, when Aristotle is talking about friendships between lovers or husband and wife, even though maybe you could say lovers and husbands and wives are a bit different, still he says that you can't be friends with somebody who you're having an erotic longing for, because your desire for their body intrudes upon what we're talking about when we're talking about a higher form of friendship. And so if I'm using your body for pleasure is better than utility, but it's intruding upon our capacity for friendship. So I think the question's a little bit unfair to Aristotle, because if you follow his system, it implies that, if you were to ask him to think through the life of a marriage, you can't be friends. Spouses can't be friends with one another when they're young and hot and sexy, because they're going to be, knocking boots. But they could be friends later on as they age, because there's going to be a way in which that's going to subside, by nature. And therefore, if you've chosen correctly and you weren't blinded by your erotic desires, you could have chosen somebody who you want to enter into a conversation with later on once the body subsides, right? And so I think this is possible. Now, he also, you're right, says that you can't have friendship between unequals. However, friendship between unequals can always then be established via praise. So I think the only set of unequals who says it's impossible is actually friendships between humans and gods. He says we can't do this. But again, that's because, as a previous questioner asked, the incarnation hadn't taken place. They didn't have any idea about it. It hadn't been revealed to us that there was this possibility that we could be raised up, or that God would come down to us, or however you want to talk about it. And so I think, even in that, Aristotle would say, well, yeah, you could have friendship between a husband and wife. However, because a male is superior to a female in some sense, the female is going to have to praise the male to establish equality before they can enter into this virtuous friendship. And that virtuous friendship is only going to happen later in life, once the intrusion of erotic desire subsides. Okay, that's a long answer to try to defend Aristotle, but I see what you're saying, and I want to try to make the case for why it is that Aquinas would say that Aristotle's wrong, and Christian friendship between husband and wife is better than pagan friendship between a husband and wife. And of course, this is, you see early patristics who agree on this issue. And so Gosh, I was just talking about this with a buddy of mine, and so let me pull up the. There were early fathers like Saint John Chrysostom speaks of husbands and wife as close, loving friends. As just another example, so it's not just Aquinas. This is pretty common in the Christian tradition, and it's a sort of revolutionary thing, right? As with many issues related to women. Okay, well, Chrysostom and these guys basically didn't have sex with their wives. And so I think we need to factor that in as we think through why is it that these early Christians and the Aquinas who's celibate, are able to have this friendship with their wives. And so one of the things that you see with Christianity is that there is an actual virtue related to chastity. And previously, I think when you talk to, if you were to talk to Plato and Aristotle, they might say, well, there's a certain amount of self-control that's necessary. They might say, the pleasures of the body are not as important as the pleasures of the mind. But I don't know that they're going to say there's something particularly virtuous about chastity per se. And in Christianity, you really see people making that argument. So I think if you see that Christianity exposes something, right? Grace is always perfecting nature. And the Christian revelation shows us that there's something really beautiful about chastity. You have to go to where Aquinas is talking about chastity to be able to see why he's going to then make the argument about husbands and wives can be best friends. Because in chastity, and in that sense, it's not in such great disagreement with Aristotle, right? Because Aristotle is going to say, once you ditch the erotic desires, if you could overcome that, if you didn't want them anymore, then maybe. So anyhow, that's a long answer. Hopefully it's adequate.
That's very interesting. Our good friend Brittany asks, is union with Christ the mean between apotheosis, and Aristotle's impossibility of being a friend with God? And then I think a clarifying question, is the beatific vision not perfected in the resurrection of our bodies? Or is Thomas set against the body enough that he would deny this? Maybe those are two independent questions, actually.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll deal with them as separate questions, and then I'll try to think of a way in which I can relate them, even if they're not meant to be.
Yes, perfect.
So union with Christ is, in fact, when Aristotle talks about friend, we can't be friends with a god, we can't become a god, I don't want my friend to be a god, all these questions that keep coming up. He's just banging his head against this issue. I think union with Christ is very deeply important to me, and I'm and if you've listened to the Ad Fontes podcast recently, right, Anzi and I sort of joke about this, because it is an answer to the problem of the human desire for theosis, which is the logical endpoint of human desire. Most of us are not attentive to our desires enough. Just like, when you first drink wine, you're not attentive to what's going on in the glass. You're just like knocking it back, or revolted by it and moving away from it. But I think when we give words enough to the core of what it is that is our desires, the ultimate words we're going to give is that, as Theages knew, he wants to be a god. The human desire for deification is pretty universal, and so union with Christ is sort of the means by which that desire itself is satisfied. We get that in Christ too. The beatific vision is not unrelated to the resurrection of the bodies. However, I think what Aquinas' point is going to be is that the vision of God is not completed, or strictly speaking, a vision of the eye. It's a vision of the mind. And so it's not that he doesn't think you're going to be resurrected, or that the resurrection isn't, it's a charm. It's this, piece of charmingness that comes along with. There's something kind of beautiful and fitting about it. But because the vision of God isn't happening with my optic nerve, if you had to ask yourself, could you be happy, without the resurrection of the body, or without the knowing who God was? I actually don't even want to answer the question because it's too tricky.
All right. And then I guess this final question, do you have a favorite translator for Aristotle?
I'll just use Martin Ostwald, not because he's the best, but just because he's the first one that I ran into and read a lot of, and so it really sat with me. There are many other really excellent translators that are out there, and I've read them. Aristotle is one of those people who tends to attract better translators than not, because there's not some sort of like deep desire to politicize him. I think probably he is more boring than I realize he is. And so therefore it just doesn't attract. It's not like there's a lot of sexy young translators who are like, I'm going to do the woke version of Aristotle. It's just like too much work, too much time, too much Greek, not enough of an audience. So the people who translate him, I tend to find really just love him, and that's why they're doing it. And so, anyhow, but Ostwald is the one that I speak in my mind when I talk about Aristotle.
Ty Smith asks, my question concerns the necessity of fleshly goods for happiness. If we by nature are rational animals and we will be reunited with our animal nature for eternity, then do we not need some sort of bodily goods in glory for the ultimate fulfillment of our nature, rather than sort of viewing bodily goods as a charming addition to perfect felicity?
Yeah, so it's an argument from fittingness, right, that Aquinas is making in some ways. Clearly, and so maybe to make an analogy, we can like Aristotle is doing something similar in the end of book 7, beginning of book 8, when he's beginning to ask the question, do we need friends? And here's the similarity. The similarity is that when Aristotle is asking whether we need friends, what he's really asking is, well, isn't it true that if I become virtuous and I have enough, material possessions to feed and clothe and house myself, and I, as a contemplating being, knowing what thinking is, that thinking is always in some sense dialectical and conversational, can't I just be alone and have this conversation in my head? And, on one sense, yeah, that's true. You can. But there's something kind of not fitting about it. It's not the most human thing to say. And so if I can just kind of have a conversation in my head, or if I can have a conversation with Joe, clearly I should have the conversation with Joe, because I'm human. And so it's not fitting for me to sort of do it alone, even though you can have a sort of a happiness that way. I read Aquinas is making a very similar move when he says that the bodily goods are, a sort of a charm that attends to it. It's like, my friends who've had COVID, the version where they lose their sense of smell, have said, they can eat dinner, and dinner does the job, and they even will enjoy the taste to some extent, but they're missing their sense of smell. So what does the smell add? Well, it does add something. Like we would not want to think about our lives without the sense of smell. And yet, what is it that it's adding? How would you give words to it? It's adding a certain charm. And so it's sort of not fitting for us to talk about it as being perfectly happy if you don't have the body, given what we are. But that's distinct from saying, can you think about what happiness is from the perspective of a being without a body? Because I think like what Aquinas has in mind that we don't. So when we approach this, right, as Protestants, we approach it as people who are like, the Bible says there's a resurrection, WTF Aquinas, like stick to the Bible, buddy. And when Aquinas is approaching the question, at least one thing he has in mind that we don't is angels. And so one question we have to ask is, are angels happy? And that's tricky, right? I think angels are happy, if they're not fallen, and therefore there has to be a form of happiness which does not involve the body, which we have the capacity to participate in, and which we need actually for what we are to be fulfilled in our happiness. And yet we also have the body, and so just leaving our body is sort of like a potential option for us, right? We could just kind of transmogrify ourselves into angels, I guess. And yet the maintaining, the returning of the body to ourselves is a sort of you know, a charm that attends to the perfections of happiness, which the angels also have.
Is part of the answer to that question that the beatific vision, you mentioned we have a capacity for this vision of God, but that the beatific vision in a way is God raising us up to know him in an immediate way that the angels know him, whereas our mind in this life is mediated through the body, and so it's always a discursive, always developing, always dialectical thing. And so all of these faculties are raised up in the resurrection, and yet what you see in the beatific vision nevertheless is that thing that spiritual souls, I guess, are capable of, but require some kind of switch flip, if you will, from God to sort of raise our capacities to know him in that mode.
Oh, totally. This is a great way of trying to approach it. And I'm really glad you said it, Joe. So, always chime in when I'm sort of like fumbling over myself. I would say one thing to just bounce off of that is, one of the mistakes we often make is to say that, we imagine the bodily resurrection as a resurrection of this body as it is now. And we do that naturally because we can't imagine a different body. Mm-hmm. Right. But our body will be as Christ's body in the resurrection, which is a different kind of a body. Like, it's doing all kinds of things I can't do. I can't walk on water and walk through walls. And,
there's enough continuity that the tomb is empty, but there's enough discontinuity that the body can't die anymore. And apparently it can ascend to heaven.
Totally. And so, the ways in which I can see God, I think, as Paul says, right, it's through a glass darkly. And we have to be kind of polished up. It's going to be a different kind of an experience of the contemplation of God when I bodily contemplate God in the resurrection. It's the same God, right? We're thinking it's the same God. It's even, I think, the same activity. Contemplation is contemplation. What you're participating in when you contemplate God, when you contemplate Christ, is not other than the beatific vision. Particularly in terms of its end and its activity, but the mechanism is going to be radically different.
Right. Bart C. Then I think this is our final question, unless anybody last call, I suppose, folks, at the bar of knowledge here. But Bart C.'s question: was Aristotle a friend of God? If you were as charitable as many have been with the ancient philosophers, what would be your answer? That's a good question.
That's a really hard question. I'm not willing to say that he was a friend of God in the sense that Abraham was. He longs for it. And so maybe we could say in the longing, there is a form of faith. And if you want to say that, then we could say that Aristotle's a friend of God in some sense. I'm not sure I'm willing to go there. And so, if I'm just glad I'm not the jury, right? Because the jury is still out here. I actually think, and I didn't get into it in this lecture, that there's a good deal of like, subtly hidden hubris inside of Aristotle, and that he is, in a sense, trying to play the role of God relative to the reader, and construct a sense of himself as the man of practical wisdom, right? Himself as the person who's somehow transcending death as he gets his thoughts into you. I think this is a bit of his strategy for how he's going to solve the problems that he's aware of, but he's not really making you explicitly aware of in exactly the same way he's aware of it. And if that's the case, then the real danger of the philosophers is pride. That is the temptation of the philosophers, and it is not coincidental that this is the temptation of Satan. And so, the longer I study this stuff, one of the jokes at Davenant Hall is that I'm the guy who they go to and I teach them all the ancient Greek stuff, right? And the more I teach this stuff, the more I really, realize that it's sort of caustic in a way. We in the contemporary era tend to read these guys and be really excited about the kind of ways in which we can, pillage it and deploy it for the sake of the gospel. But when you read the patristics, they're more sanguine. They're a little bit more cautious about it, and they recognize that Christianity contains what we already wanted when we go to these people, and in a way that they could never have understood. Right? That there's a richness inside the faith that's inaccessible to philosophy outside of theology.
Yeah, you think almost of like the kind of personality that a sort of stoic absorption of the fact of death requires. It requires an intellectual who does a lot of contemplating. There's something really powerful that a slave, a mom, can meet the resurrected Christ and actually overcome the fear of death in a deeper way, in a more profound way, not through numbing one's desire to live.
Right.
But rather but genuinely becoming courageous in death.
Right.
And that it's very fascinating.
Or extensive study, right? I mean, one way of thinking about God is that God is this all-knowing being who we come to and is going to provide us the answers and help us solve the problem of death. And that's kind of what Aristotle and Plato are promising. Like, you go to them and they have all these answers and they're going to help you solve the problems of life and the problems of death. And and because of that, I'm not the one to judge them per se. But I think actually reading him in the tragic light helps both recognize the problems that are inherent in his system, and actually helps me to have pity for him, which is what I really need. Like, that's what I really need, is not to think of whether he's in heaven or hell, but like, I need to have pity for this guy,
Yeah. Ty Smith goes on to ask, which Protestants make the greatest improvement on Aquinas's improvement on Aristotle's ethical system?
I am the worst possible person to ask this question of, because I read so much of Aristotle, and I then read some other people and their ethical thinking. I really appreciate that. And I think if you're not in the academic literature, it's hard to realize that. Sorry, Ty. Read Peter Martyr Vermigli. I read Vermigli. Vermigli's great. I've read some Melanchthon. Melanchthon is fantastic, and an Aristotelian as well. But when I think about this question, you have to realize, in the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, there's so many people doing so much work on Aristotle, and we don't know about almost any of it. Like almost no contemporary scholars. There's like one guy who's in Japan right now who's like the guy. It's David Sistema. Is that his name? I don't actually know how to pronounce his name, but we can put it in the notes when this goes up on YouTube. But you can like follow him on Twitter, and he talks about just like all these people that no one has a clue about. And so. Aristotle then was like completely lost. We read him a lot, and then he was like completely lost, and nobody except for like Thomists talked about him for a while. And then after Alistair MacIntyre writes After Virtue, really just like almost in my lifetime, there's this huge upswelling of people studying Aristotle, not just because they're Thomists, but because they want to study Aristotle. So I think that the great Protestant ethicists in the Aristotelian tradition are probably yet to come, which is good news.
We are publishing a book on ethics coming up. Is he a commentator on Aristotle? Traherne?
Who? Oh,
Traherne?
Oh yes. Sorry, I should have. They were passing me a softball.
Yeah.
Obviously, the answer.
He forgot to advertise. You have no idea how excited I am about this.
Obviously, the answer, the greatest Protestant Aristotelian that's ever lived, is Thomas Traherne. Everyone,
yes.
Who's also C.S. Lewis's favorite writer. So, we are publishing the Davenant Press. It should be out at the end of this year, just in time for Christmas. The first volume of Thomas Trahearn's ethics, Christian ethics, and he is a secret Aristotelian. He talks occasionally about Aristotle, but he does actually a really beautiful. I mean, his writing is fantastic. He's one of the great metaphysical poets of the English language, and the book is fantastic. And I did put together the modernization of it. So thank you, Joe. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome. Brad Kafer looks like he has the last question. How does the image of marriage as Christ in the church in Ephesians 5 factor into the shift of understanding of marriage as friendship in the Christian tradition?
Great question, Brad. I was sort of prepared a little bit for the other question about marriage because I know the person who asked it, and they prompted me a little bit ahead of time so that I could sort of come up with some thoughts. I'm not prepared for this one, but I'll have a crack at it. The architectonic of the eschaton as a marriage is just fundamental for understanding the Bible from the Christian perspective, right? So that's the first thing that has to be said is that if whereas I think the first major difference is we would say, did the Greeks even have an eschatological perspective? And I think the answer is basically no. Like, Aristotle does not think there's going to be some sort of end game solution to time, which we do. And we think that the end game solution is marriage between Christ and the church, the new heaven and the new earth, coming down, being created, even as we ourselves are created anew, right? I think so. So two things are then happening. One is the eschatological perspective is changing the Christian understanding of everything relative to the Greek understanding. And that's always not unrelated to the Christian understanding that there will be solutions to the problems of human life. Because of course there's problems historically, but then like if there's going to be a resurrection, there's really a happy ending, right? Another way to think of it, just to plug another book, is that we're publishing a book called Serious Comedy, which will be a reflection on comedy and tragedy in the Western tradition. That'll be out this summer. And in that book, one thing you notice is it's not just Aristotle who's tragic, right? Like the ancient Greeks are obsessed with tragedy. And in the West, once you get into the possibility of a post-Christian culture, right, with Nietzsche, what do you notice? They get obsessed with tragedy again. Okay, so Christianity is like the possibility. One way to think about Christianity, it's the possibility for a happy ending, for a resolution that's joyful to all the problems that we've been running into. And I think that from that perspective, we could even talk about the battle of the sexes and the problems of men and women, right? Is there a possible solution to that? Well, yeah, we would say as Christians, the solution's in Christ.
I think that's very profound. And as good with our eschatological motif right at hand, we will end here. Thank you very much, Colin, for this lecture and for these good reflections in response to these questions. Thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. Once again, you've been with us, the Davenant Institute. Come back and see our lectures, and I think we've probably advertised at least a dozen books here, so get one of them. Thank you very much, everybody, for seeing us, and we'll look forward to having you at future lectures and events.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thanks, everybody.
See you later.